Hi again, Mark here from Talkingbass.net. This week I'm going to be giving you some pointers on how to come up with your own bass riffs. Now, if any of you have been following my other lessons, especially the music theory series, you'll have already seen the lesson on how to incorporate the theory concepts like scales and chord construction into your own bass lines. That lesson was more of an overview, and I spent some time demonstrating some bass riffs based on various arpeggios and scales. So this time I'm going to start delving a little further into the creation of riffs and how you can come up with your own. So what is a riff? Well, a riff is a recurring musical motif used as a backdrop or even a main theme to a song or an instrumental piece. I'm sure you all probably knew that already, so let's take a look at a few famous examples and take them apart to see what they're made of. Now, analysing riffs and licks and chord progressions is a great way to see how other people created the music that you enjoy, and so that you can use those techniques and principles in your own writing. So I'm going to try some riffs in various styles, so people don't get left out. I don't really want to spend a lot of time analysing country and western riffs, while a load of death metal fans sit there bored wondering how this can have any relevance to them. But it's important to remember that the main principles behind writing music are the same no matter what the style. The riffs that we're going to be discussing are going to be mainly from the pop and rock and roll era onwards. So let's start with some old riffs from the 1950s and see how or if they've changed at all over the years. Now, some riffs are actual themes or hooks by which you can recognise a song, and they can be played by bass alone or doubled by other instruments like guitar. And some riffs are intended simply as a backdrop while a melody plays over the top. So here's a riff used in the song Lucille by Little Richard. This riff's more of a backdrop than a main theme, even though it acts as a main hook to start the song. And I'll play it with the drum beat in the background so you can hear how it relates to that. So in analysing a riff, we need to look at a few things. First of all, it's worth knowing the general key of the piece. Now, Lucille's in C, but it's a 12-bar blues progression, so the chords are not necessarily from the C major or C minor scales. They're a little more coloured by all being dominant sevenths. But for our purposes, all we need to know is that it's in C, okay? Now, if you don't know the general key of a piece that you're analysing, don't worry, you can still analyse the riff. Next, it's worth knowing what chords are being used. Now, this can be really important because we're going to relate a lot of the notes in the riffs to the actual chords. Now, riffs are often made up solely of chord tones, and they can help to outline a particular chord progression. We're also going to look at passing tones moving between these chord tones, and all of this can help us get deeper into the riff and see what's going on under the surface. Then we can alter or transpose the riff or just apply the underlying principles elsewhere. Other times, a riff might be used simply to outline a scale or a mode, and the chords can be independent of the melody in the riff. The notes that we play will still be related to the chords somewhere in there, but not necessarily outlining the progression. Either way, knowing the chords or the progressions in there is really important to us. So, as I mentioned, Lucille is a basic 12-bar blues progression in the standard rock and roll manner. So we've got three chords. We've got C7, then we've got F7, and we've also got G7. So that's our palette of chords, C7, F7 and G7, chords 1, 4 and 5 in C. So this riff's only one bar in length and works over one chord rather than weaving through a bunch of chords like some riffs do. Now that can make it really easy to analyse melodically because we can just relate the riff to that single chord. So let's take this riff apart melodically and see if we can see any familiar patterns, okay? So going through it note by note, we've got C, there, 3rd fret on the A string, repeated, so then we've got the E, 2nd fret on the D string, G, the 5th fret on the D string, and then we're up to the B flat there, the 3rd fret on the G string, and we repeat that, okay, so going up. So we'll repeat that B flat, and then we just up to the C, the octave, and back to the B flat, okay, so we've got C, C, E, G, B flat, C, B flat. And in relationship to the key, we've got 1, 3, 5, flat 7, octave, and back to the flat 7, okay? So what familiar patterns have we got in there? Now, if you've been going through the chord construction lessons, you should recognise that pattern straight away. It should just jump out at you. It's a C7 arpeggio, okay? C dominant 7 arpeggio. So have that C7 arpeggio and the riff, which works perfectly because, as I mentioned before, the chord in the background is a C7. So this riff is just using the notes of that chord exclusively, the C7, okay? So the first lesson that we can learn from looking at this riff is that chord tones or arpeggios are good solid building blocks. That riff uses chord tones exclusively. We have no other scale movement or anything, just the chord tones. So the rest of that song's all based on a 12-bar blues progression in C. And as I mentioned before, that's just the three chords C7, F7 and G7. Now the riff that we've looked at is all based on a dominant 7 arpeggio over the C7, so it's really easy to just move that pattern from the C7 to an F7 and up to a G7. Here it is on the C7. We just transpose that pattern down to an F7, to a G7, and that's simply because it's using all chord tones on a dominant 7 arpeggio. If it was all chord tones and it was a different chord, obviously it'd be a little bit different and we'd have to adjust it, but this just moves quite easily through the progression. So here's that riff moving through those 12 bars. So that's a really basic analysis of the melodic and harmonic ingredients of the riff, but if we want to analyse it a little more, we can look at how the arc of it. So we've got this dominant 7 arpeggio rising up from the root, up to that flattened 7th there. Now the flattened 7th is responsible for a lot of that bluesy sound of the dominant 7 chord. It's without it, with it. Okay, so we've got that bluesy sound there, and we're hitting that flattened 7th on the 3rd beat. Okay, so on the 1st beat we've got the root, and then on the flat 7ths on the 3rd. Now the 1st beat and the 3rd beat are the 2 strong beats in the bar. Okay, so we're really milking that bluesy flavour by putting that flat 7th there on the 3rd beat, and a nice solid foundation by having the root there on the 1st. Every note has some kind of flavour in relationship to the chord in operation and also to the root note or tonic of the key. And it's how we use these colours and flavours that can provide a different sound or flavour to your riff. Now if I change the riff slightly and take out the 7th and just emphasise the 5th or G a little more, you'll hear how it sounds. Or in another way. Now I'll put that flat 7th back in. And so you can hear that bluesy flavour coming in. I'll be covering some more riffs that use non-chord tones so we can see how they work, but for now we'll just stick to chord tones so we don't overcomplicate matters. So now we can analyse the rhythmic side of things, and this is probably the most important part of the riff, especially for us bass players. So rhythmically, this riff is just a constant stream of 8th notes or quavers. If we remove the melodic side of things and just play the rhythm of the riff on a static C, we end up with this. Okay, so again with the melody. Now that might seem really straightforward and nothing to really learn from, but remember the whole feel of this song is very raw and driving in nature, and that constant pump of notes really helps to emphasise the push and drive of the drum beat. Many times the drum beat will come before the riff, and it'll always be the main source of inspiration, as you'll want to both lock in with the groove and possibly emphasise the feel and accents. Now I'm going to be looking at how different riffs are created over a variety of different beats. So when writing a riff, don't just think of your bass in isolation. Think in terms of writing for the rhythm section and band as a whole, and you'll probably be much more creative in the long run. So the drum beat for this tune is a really straight rock and roll feel with a beat that's commonly played like this. And the count is 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the bass drum and snare are the parts that we really want to look at. So we've got a bass drum on 1 and 3 and a heavy snare on 2 and 4, giving us that big rock backbeat, okay? There's no swing or shuffle to this kind of beat, it's just that stereotypical driving rock groove. So there's a few variations on this beat where we double up with eighth notes in various parts of the bar, okay? Usually on beats 1 and 3, okay? So the first variation would have 2 bass drum beats on 3, okay? So it'd be 1, 2, 3 and 4. 1, 2, 3 and 4, and that sounds a little like this. Or we could try it with a bass drum doubled up on beat 1, okay? 1 and 2, 3, 4. Or we could have doubled up bass drums on beats 1 and 3, so this is both of them. And that one in particular matches up quite well with the riff because of the... We can also add a bass drum hit on the end of 2, so it's anticipating that beat 3, the bass drum on beat 3, okay? And that'll sound something like this. And you recognise that as a really popular beat. Now, the reason I didn't mention that beat before the other variations is because it's got a slightly different feel, simply because of the anticipation of beat 3. We're looking at a particularly driving riff, so the first variations that we looked at have got more force, as you can hear. So you can hear the driving feel of that beat, as opposed to this one. That anticipation kind of removes a little bit of the forcefulness. When we've got it bang on the beat, we're really emphasising that beat 1 and 3. Now, even though I say that there's more force in those other variations, the riff does sit fine with all of the beats. And remember that it's how we put all this together that creates the vibe that we're trying to achieve. Remember, there's no right or wrong. You can use whatever musical tactics that you want to express what you want to express. So going back to that original beat, if we didn't already have a riff to play over there and someone presented us with that drum beat, the stereotypical way to follow a beat without anything written would be a standard root fifth kind of pattern following the bass drum. People always say, follow the bass drum if in doubt, okay? So if we did that, okay, so that's pretty boring. There's just none of that drive. There's none of the propulsion that you get with that the rock and roll Lucille riff, okay? So now let's compare the two. So there was the root fifth following the bass drum pattern. Now let's kick in with the higher propulsion level of the pedal, okay? So just pedaling on the C. Much more drive. So it's worth taking note that we're actually doubling the same rhythm as the hi-hat, okay? So we're still locking in with the drum beat even though we're playing more notes than the bass drum snare combination. It's also interesting to note that, as I mentioned before, the double note and flattened seventh occur at places where we might have the 2 bass drum hits, so on beats 1 and 3. So we're playing in tune, even though we're playing in tune with the hi-hat, we're actually emphasising the bass drum beats in the melodic side of the riff. So this is a really popular rhythm to use for a riff, and we can easily find other songs that you might have heard using this kind of rhythm, along with that heavy backbeat groove. Okay, so there's the famous Peter Gunn theme. There's also Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison, which is actually one note different from Lucille. If we were to play it on a C, you can see how Lucille we're just putting that D in there instead of the repeat of the B flat. There's also the Hippie Hippie Shake by the Swingin' Blue Jeans. This just sticks with the triad notes rather than venturing up to that flattened seventh. Or we've got more modern metal tunes like Metallica's Master of Puppets. Or if we use 16th notes instead of 8th notes, we get the same driving pulse but with a halftime feel, like the song Hysteria by Muse. Now, on the face of it, it's hard to imagine how we can draw a similarity between Little Richard and Metallica, but that driving rhythm is a foundation of the rock and roll feel, and you just can't go wrong with it if you're wanting that kind of vibe. The 8th note pedal is used in thousands of songs as the standard rock comp pattern through a chord progression, and you'll have played it hundreds of times. So, now that's basically, as I mentioned earlier, the same as the other riffs, but cut down to its bare essentials of that 8th note pulse. Now, before we move on to some other riffs, let's take a look at what we can take from these, all these riffs, and use in creating our own. When making up your own riffs, we generally think rhythmically, even if we don't realise it. As we've seen, the notes can change, but the feel of the riff will still remain the same. So we can use or modify a riff from another song and just use our own set of notes. Now, if I take that Lucille riff and just use a random weird set of notes, like this, but we're keeping that same rhythm and we're keeping it in a one bar recurring cycle, we can still keep that same kind of groove going over the drum beat. Okay, so we've used the rhythm from the first riff from Lucille to come up with something completely different. So now let's try a few more normal variations on that riff. First of all, we could just use a different pattern of chord tones, okay? So the Lucille riff is just a dominant 7 arpeggio. We get repeat of the root, goes up the arpeggio to the flat 7, repeats, up to the octave and back, okay? So we could keep the repeats in there, okay, for the sake of the groove, and then just change the 3rd and 5th to a 5th and 3rd. So we're going 1, 1, 5, 3, instead of 1, 1, 3, 5. Okay, so we're just changing them around, the chord tones, the order of the chord tones, that is. Okay, so the original riff was. Now we have. So it's only a slight variation, but it's a variation. Now let's try something else. Instead of going up to the octave after the flat and 7th, let's just try coming back down the arpeggio, okay? So the original was. So we went up to the octave and back, now let's come down. So we've come back down, so we've got 1, 1, 3, 5, flat, 7, 5, 3, and we're back. As opposed to. Now let's stick with that variation of coming back down from the flat 7, but this time we'll change the beginning to root, root, 3rd, root instead of root, root, 3rd, 5th. So the original one was a little more progressive in moving up, a little smoother, but now we've got a bit of a leap. So it does change the feel of it a little bit. Again, it's just a simple reordering of the chord tones. Now let's change the flat 7 to the 5th, and we'll try a few variations from there, okay? So this is going to be a little bit smoother. So we've got root, root, 3rd, root, 5th, and this time we'll go up to the 7th and the octave, okay? The flat 7 octave. Okay? Now let's change that flat 7th to the 5th and try a few variations from there, okay? So instead of the big jump up to the flat 7, we've got root, root, 3rd, root, and now we're going to the 5th. And the first variation we'll use will be 5th, flat 7, octave. Okay, so we're just going up the arpeggio. Or we can try moving up to the flat 7th and then back to the 5th, okay? So that gives us 2 variations. Now let's change the beginning to root, root, 5th, root. instead of root, root, third root, okay? So we've got root, root, fifth root, and then let's go from the fifth, flat 7 octave. Okay? Or we could try flat 7 back to the fifth. Of course, we can also add the upper octave in there. So let's try jumping straight up to the octave and then trying a few variations on the chord tones below. Or so there are obviously thousands of basic variations on this riff that we can create melodically, and that's simply using the notes of the dominant 7th arpeggio and chord tones. Now the tempo is also important. If we take that Lucille riff again and play it at a really, really slow tempo just to exaggerate the point, we get something like this. Now if we try one of the variations that we used earlier on at that slower tempo, we can get something like this. Now if we try the riff at a really fast tempo, we get a riff like this. And with some of the variations. Now we can try a change of feel. So we'll go for a shuffle feel, okay? So with the original riff. And at a slower tempo. Now if we go back to the original tempo and feel, we only used repeated notes twice in the riff. So how about adding a few more? So let's try doubling the root, the third and the fifth, and then we can just let that flat 7 move up to the octave for the change at the end. So we would get... So instead of the original, we've now got... All the riffs that we've been creating so far with these variations have been based on the notes of the dominant 7 arpeggio. But we can do whatever we want. So let's try changing the chord type. So here's the original riff on a dominant 7. Let's try changing it to a C major 7. So that dominant 7 there, the B flat, is going to be moved to the B. Okay, so that gives us a very different sounding riff. Or we could try it with the minor 7, okay? So there it's just the third that's been changed from an E down to an E flat, so from a third to the minor third, okay? So the original, minor 7. Here we'll try with something very different sounding, a C minor 7 flat 5. So the third's going to be flattened and the fifth's going to be flattened. The flat 7's just the same. So if we stick with that minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio for a minute and have a see what we can do with it, let's first of all just try moving it to a different root note. That's something we've not tried yet. Just change to a different root note and use that pattern, okay? So let's move up to an E flat. So this is on an E flat minor 7 flat 5. So if we try with a different combination of the chord tones, we might get something like this. Okay, and if we apply the drum beat there, you can hear how this riff still keeps that same kind of groove with the pumping 8th note feel. So all these riffs are just using that same pumping rhythm, and just by changing some of the notes and other aspects like tempo, it's pretty easy to just mess around and come up with your own riffs. Now let's try something a little different. Let's take some notes out of the riff. Now when we do this, we can either introduce a gap or hold one of the notes for a longer duration. So each method's going to give a different effect. So let's go back to the original Lucille riff on the C7 arpeggio. Now instead of the opening repeated note on the C, let's just hold that note for a quarter note or crotchet, and that'll give us the following. Now, if we try that with the drum beat, we can hear how holding that note still works. Now, if we just remove that second note so that we've got a space, that riff sounds like this. So the first note's cut short. So notice the difference between these two variations. They've both got slightly different feels. The held note one's got more of a laid back kind of drive, while that shorter, more staccato note's got more of an edgy feel. So we'll stick with the held note for now, and let's just remove the third. So this is going to give us an even longer held opening note, and the riff's going to take on a completely different feel with a dotted quarter eighth note feel in the first half of the bar. So it ends up sounding like this. So the original riff. Now we've got. And with the drum beat, it sounds like this. So now let's try a little variation on that riff by going back down to the fifth instead of going up to the octave, okay? So now we have, as opposed to, so we can now take out another note. So we'll remove the repeated note up here at this flat 7, up here at the B flat, okay, which gives us. So we're always watering down that driving feel. So now if we try the variation of going back down to the fifth instead of up to the octave, we have. Which with the drum beat. So if we compare this stripped down riff with our original Lucille riff, we can hear how we're still retaining some of the key elements in there, but with less of that incessant drive. So the original riff, and now with our stripped down bare bones version. Now, as I mentioned before, this is neither good nor bad. It completely depends on the feel that you want to achieve. So if we take this concept of removing notes a little further, then we can start to look at how the actual space in the riff can take on a character of its own. If we look at the famous riff You Really Got Me by the Kinks, we've got that same heavy backbeat rock groove, but only 5 notes. 4 at the beginning of the bar and 1 to lead into it. And out of those 5 notes, we've only got 2 different pitches for the whole thing. So it goes like this. So we've got that, it's in G. We've got starting on the F, going to the G. F, G, G, F, G, and with the beat. So this is in G and pretty much in that same G7 kind of vibe, although it's based more on power chords without any kind of defined major or minor modality. G to F and back gives us the root and the flat 7, which is enough to give us that harder edge. If the riff used a major 7th, it'd sound something like this. As opposed to, which has that harder edge with the flat 7. So again, we're going for that raw, solid, driving feel, but this time the actual simplicity and lack of notes conveys as much energy as the Lucille riff did, because the space is being used to let the drums really do the talking. but underneath it, the rhythm is actually very similar. If we were to fill that space up with something, so we'll use the root note of G, then the beat will still dictate that consistent eighth note pulse. And if you've heard the Van Halen cover of this tune, then you've probably heard this, this kind of effect. So there I'm just filling up that space with the G pedal, okay, so the original, and now filled up. There's also a couple of other reasons why we might cut that riff down into a smaller chunk. One, it's catchier and easier to remember. Absolutely everybody knows the "You Really Got Me" riff. It's simple, to the point, and it sticks in your head. It's kind of like the Jaws theme with that. That simplicity can be a trademark and make it really recognisable and singable. And two, it really emphasises the lyric. Now, this is another thing that you're going to have to bear in mind if you're writing for a song rather than instrumental. So you really have to take that lyric into account, both rhythmically, melodically, and from a meaning sense. If you were just playing a pedal under the words, "You really got me," it just wouldn't have the emphasis and conviction, but double it up like this, "You really got me," and it really gets the point across. So I'll leave it there for now before the length of this lesson gets completely out of hand. Try coming up with your own variations on that riff and just go crazy messing around. Play over a drum beat like the one that I've been using and see how it can inspire you to come up with stuff, and play around with all those little construction aspects that I've gone through. There's almost a limitless number of things that you can do to even a one-bar riff like that, and you can try the same method of playing around with other riffs with different feels. So try different orders of the chord tones, try different chord types, try different rhythmic variations. Also try extending the riff over several bars, and like I say, it's completely limitless. Okay, in the next riff lesson, I'm going to move on to some different styles and beats and look at how syncopation and different accents can be used. Subscribe to the YouTube channel for more of my lessons and updates on the weekly releases. There's quite a few lessons on all aspects of bass playing. Also check out talkingbass.net for more lessons, articles and downloads. You can get a free scale reference guide ebook when you sign up, and you'll get news on updates sent directly to your inbox. I'm also now available for Skype lessons, so just go on over to talkingbass.net for the details, and you can contact me via email or the form at the website, and I'd love to hear from you. So okay, see you later.